On a cold September night in 1837, a young woman walks alone through a dark alley in the outskirts of London. All is quiet, gas lamps flickering dimly in the distance. But without warning, a figure emerges from the shadows. Towering and impossibly fast, he seizes her. Clawed fingers tear at her clothing as she struggles to break free. A sudden blue flash illuminates the alley, and then he's gone, vanished. Was this a madman? A ghost? One thing is certain, it won't be the last attack. Join us tonight on Uncanny Alley as we explore the many bizarre and violent encounters with a figure the British press would come to call Spring-Heeled Jack. In 1837, London was a city of stark contrasts. The streets were crowded and often unsanitary, filled with the hustle of industrial progress, but also the hardship of the poor. Smoke from factories hung thickly in the air, and the narrow alleys, dimly lit by flickering gas lamps, created a claustrophobic atmosphere of uncertainty and fear after dark. Crime was rampant, and with a relatively young police force still finding its footing, many neighborhoods fell under the shadow of lawlessness. Polly Adams, a young barmaid, had spent the evening pouring pints for rowdy dock workers, dodging drunken advances, and carrying heavy trays of ale through the tavern where she was employed. By the time the last patron staggered out, her feet ached, and the muscles in her arms burned from a long night's work. Now, with the tavern finally closed, she stepped into the damp London night, eager for rest. Kent Road was a wide thoroughfare stretching across the southeastern edge of London. Lined with a mix of industrial sites, workers' homes, small shops and meadows, the road cut through both urban areas and open spaces. At night, its wide expanse became quieter, the occasional flicker of a lamp illuminating the pavement, casting long shadows along the road, which seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. Tonight, the street was eerily quiet, and she walked with a sense of growing unease, aware that parts of the road were far from safe. Reminding herself she had walked the area countless times before, she continued on. But on this night, something felt different. The air was heavier and quieter than usual. As she passed an alley, she saw something that made her blood run cold. From the darkness of the alley leered a pale white, almost ghostly face. Before she could react, the figure emerged from the darkness. He wore a long, flowing cape, but she didn't have time to observe carefully, for he suddenly reached out to her. His fingertips pointed with sharp, razor-like attachments that seemed to be made of iron. Her horrified stare made its way from these razors, or claws, back to the man's eyes. For a moment, she wasn't sure what would happen. He suddenly struck at her, slashing open her bodice in a frenzy. Before she could cry out, the assailant struck again, slashing at her chest and abdomen, leaving deep, burning scratches. The assailant then did something completely unexpected. He spat a large burst of fire out of his mouth directly at her face. The brightness of the flames blinded her for a moment, and as her vision slowly returned, she realized she was once again alone. The attacker had vanished. Polly stumbled to the nearest house for help, having no idea hers was only the first in what would become a long series of bizarre attacks. On another similar night, scarcely a month later, a young woman named Mary Stevens hurried along the narrow, dimly lit streets near Lavender Hill in Battersea. She was returning home after finishing her duties for the day as a servant. The city never truly slept, but here, away from the centre of London, the roads were quieter, emptier. The faint glow of gas lamps barely cut through the thick London fog, and the distant sounds of hooves on cobblestones echoed from the main roads. Nearby, the vast, shadowy expanse of Clapham Common loomed, its paths deserted at this hour. But then, a sudden flash of movement from the darkness. As his ice-cold hands gripped her arms, to Mary they felt more like steel clamps. She only caught a glimpse of his face before looking away in horror, but she saw his eyes were wild, burning in the glare of the street lamps, and his complexion was more like a corpse's than a man's. He forced her close, his fingers tightening as his lips twisted into something between a grin and a snarl. He scratched her, but then suddenly he reeled back. Mary watched on, petrified as he turned and leapt, a strange, unnatural leap which carried him upward over a high wall and out of sight. This was, Mary explained, a jump no ordinary man could have made. Confused and frightened, Mary staggered on, her screams moments later bringing a few concerned Londoners to her aid. Over the next few months, several other young women throughout suburban London were coming forward. They too had been attacked by the strange assailant. Each described him as ghostly, wearing clawed gloves, and possessing an inhuman ability which allowed him to escape over high walls and hedges before help could arrive. Reports flooded into the office of London's Lord Mayor, Sir John Cowan. Then, on the morning of January 9th, he received a letter from a resident of Peckham that would bring the terror into the public eye. The letter, published days later in the Times, was the first of many which described a fiendish assailant prowling the city's fog-choked streets and beyond. Sightings placed him in Hammersmith, where he had frightened several young women into, quote, dangerous fits. In Kensington and Ealing, he was seen leaping impossibly high into the air after terrifying numerous women, tearing at their clothing from behind. At first, the Lord Mayor remained skeptical, but as he received more accounts, shopkeepers swearing they saw the figure vanish into the night, servants too terrified to walk home alone, his doubt began to waver. A trusted confidant related to him that a servant girl in Forest Hill had been scared to fits by the strange attacker. Finally, in a public address at the Mansion House, he acknowledged the numerous reports and vowed to investigate. A special vigilance committee was formed, its purpose clear: hunt down the phantom that had turned the city into a place of dread. The press began reporting on the encounters, giving the mysterious figure the moniker Spring-Heeled Jack. Spring-heeled after his jumping ability, and Jack because in 19th century England, Jack was often used as a generic term for an unknown or mischievous male figure. By January 20th, the Sun newspaper began to speculate that the attacks were actually instigated by a group of aristocrats who, for a wager of £5,000, had, quote, undertaken to personify a supernatural being. The paper claimed the object of the wager was to, quote, destroy the lives of not less than 30 human beings, including 8 old bachelors, 10 old maids and 6 ladies' maids, and as many servant girls as they can, by depriving them of their reason and otherwise accelerating their deaths. But the newspaper's wild claim was apparently made without substantiation or any real evidence. As newspapers eagerly competed to outdo one another with increasingly sensational stories and theories, many in the public began to question whether Spring-Heeled Jack was real at all. That is, until he attacked a woman in full view of her family, all of whom were considered credible by the authorities and the public. February 19th, 1838. A thick fog choked the air outside the Alsop family home on Bearbinder Lane, its tendrils creeping toward the doorstep. Inside, 18-year-old Jane Alsop sat with her sisters, enjoying the quiet of the evening. The Alsops were a respectable family. Her father, John Alsop, was a victualler, a tradesman in the business of food and drink. While they weren't wealthy, they lived comfortably in a modest but well-kept house on what was then the outskirts of the city. Then, suddenly, a furious knocking shattered the stillness. A man's voice rang out from the other side of the door.
"For God's sake, bring me a light! We have caught spring-heeled Jack in the lane."
Jane and her sisters froze. By now, every Londoner had heard of spring-heeled Jack. Some whispered that he was a ghost, others swore he was a madman. The voice outside was urgent, authoritative yet desperate. A police officer in need of help, no doubt. With a candle in hand, Jane moved toward the door. Her heart pounded, but she steadied herself, determined to assist. Slowly, she unlatched the door and stepped onto the threshold. At first, she was confused, because she could see nothing but fog. But then she saw him. A tall, shadowy figure materialized out of the fog, springing forward suddenly with inhuman speed, throwing back his cloak and snatching away her candle. The glow of the candle revealed the figure's terrifying features. He was dressed in a dark cloak, but beneath it, his tight-fitting clothing shimmered, appearing like a strange, dark, polished material that clung to his body, what we would recognize today as patent or PVC leather. His face, if it could even be called that, was something out of a nightmare. His eyes blazed with an unnatural light, glowing red in the darkness like burning embers. His mouth twisted into a wicked grin, revealing sharp metallic-looking teeth. He held the candle close to his chest, apparently using it to ignite a large blue fireball out of his mouth and directly into Jane's face. Dazed, she saw his hands reach out at her, long, clawed fingers tipped with metal, razor-sharp and gleaming in the dim light. The air was thick with an acrid sulfuric stench, an odor so strong it stung her nostrils. And then, pain. A searing, tearing pain as he raked his claws down her neck and dress. Jane screamed, thrashing against his hold, her mind reeling in terror. He was impossibly strong. His breath was hot against her skin, his grip tightening. Then, the door burst open. One of her sisters, drawn by her cries, rushed forward, and together the pair were able to fend off any further attacks and fight their way back inside. The figure hadn't given up, however. He pounded on their door 3 or 4 more times, leaving only when family members watching from an upstairs window began shouting for the police, who arrived soon after. But by then, there was nothing to be done. Spring-heeled Jack was gone. Jane Alsop, frightened, had come face to face with something beyond explanation, and she would not be the last. Her detailed testimony, along with the injuries she sustained, made the public take the spring-heeled Jack events more seriously. People began locking their doors earlier, and watchmen patrolled the streets with heightened vigilance. But the terror wasn't over. Only a little more than a week later, on February 28th, 1838, another young woman would cross paths with the phantom attacker. It was early evening, the last glimmers of daylight fading behind the tightly packed buildings of Limehouse, a district in London's East End. Lucy Scales, a young woman of 18, walked with her sister, approaching Green Dragon Alley, an isolated and poorly lit passageway known for its eerie stillness. The sisters had just left their brother's home, where they had spent time reading and conversing. The evening was ordinary, until they turned into the alley. Spring-heeled Jack was waiting. Lucy's first thought was that the figure was a woman, because it wore a peculiar helmet or hood that she had at first assumed was a bonnet. In later encounters, he was described as wearing a helmet or hood with pointed ears or horns. As it lunged closer, blocking their way, Lucy could now see that it was a tall, gaunt man wearing a large cape over a dark but glistening, tight-fitting garment. His eyes burned with a strange, hellish light, their eerie glow cutting through the darkness. As Lucy gasped in shock, the figure suddenly spurted out a blast of blue fire right into her face. It erupted in an instant, searing and unnatural, illuminating the alleyway with a sudden, ghastly blue glow. The fire was unusual not only because of its color, but also because it didn't actually burn her skin. Instead, it choked the air, as if her breath had been completely sucked out. Lucy collapsed instantly, her body racked with convulsions as she fought for air. The overwhelming shock and terror sent her into violent seizures, her body twisting and shaking on the ground. Her sister screamed in horror, then knelt beside her. But strangely, the attacker made no further move against them. He stood motionless, watching, as if admiring his handiwork. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and vanished into the night, leaping away with an unnatural swiftness. Lucy's brother heard the commotion and arrived moments later. He found her still in the throes of convulsions, her face pale and her breath shallow. Lucy's sister, who had been with her during the attack, also described the man as tall and thin. She added another interesting detail, that he had been carrying a small device in front of him, similar to a so-called bullseye, a lamp used by policemen. Unlike Jane Alsop, Lucy bore no claw marks or torn garments, but her experience was no less traumatic. Surgeon Charles Pritchell, who treated Lucy soon after the attack, said she was, quote, suffering from hysterics and great agitation, in all probability the result of fright. Certain chemical reactions can produce cooler flames, where combustion occurs at lower temperatures, making them less likely to cause burns. Compounds like sulfur, arsenic, or phosphorus can create blue-hued flames and emit acrid, choking fumes, as described in these encounters. Early theatrical pyrotechnics and alchemical mixtures, including substances like sulfur dioxide or phosphorus-based compounds, could also produce an eerie, flickering glow while releasing a pungent, suffocating smell. However he produced it, if Spring-Heeled Jack's fire-breathing abilities were a clever chemical trick designed for intimidation, it worked well. The attacks on Jane Alsop and Lucy Scales had shaken London. Over the following months and years, sporadic reports surfaced, strange figures spotted on rooftops, shadowy intruders leaping over fences in a single bound, and lone travelers claiming to have been stalked by a gleaming-eyed spectre. Some of these accounts were vague, little more than whispers passed between nervous citizens. Others were more detailed. One night, two women strolling along a moonlit road were startled by a tall figure dressed in a, quote, very fantastic garment, who effortlessly leapt over a hedge on one side of the road and landed just ahead of them. It then vaulted over a much higher hedge on the opposite side, disappearing from view. In the Peckham area, locals spoke of a ghost that seemed to haunt the streets, capable of leaping over fences and walls that would be impossible for any normal person to scale. The next year in Sheffield, reports surfaced of a tall figure that, quote, sprang like a goat. Spring-heeled Jack was also seen bounding across rooftops in Caister, Norfolk, a bizarre sight that was witnessed by nearly the entire town. But as years went by, the attacks became less frequent. Some believed Jack had finally been caught or had fled London. Others feared he was something more than human, an entity that could appear whenever and wherever he chose. And soon, events would unfold that seemed to justify that fear, because spring-heeled Jack would strike again. Northampton, a town far removed from London's narrow, cramped streets, was not the kind of place where people expected to encounter such strangeness. Though known for its rolling countryside, quiet villages and close-knit communities, the region's peace was shattered when spring-heeled Jack arrived. Witnesses described a tall figure cloaked in darkness, his body wrapped in tight, gleaming garments that caught the moonlight. He moved with an impossible speed, bounding over hedgerows and walls with unnatural ease. Those who saw him up close spoke of his piercing, glowing eyes and a face twisted into something grotesque, almost inhuman. His attacks were as swift as they were shocking. In multiple instances, young women were targeted, just as they had been in London. He would emerge from the shadows and lunge at his victims, his metallic claws ripping at their clothes and skin. Screams rang out in the night, but no matter how many people pursued him, no matter how fast they ran, Jack was always faster. One particularly chilling account spoke of a lone traveler walking near the outskirts of town when he was suddenly confronted by a dark figure standing in the middle of the road. Before he could react, the figure let out a hideous, high-pitched laugh and leapt straight into the air, clearing a high stone wall in a single bound. The people of the village of Northampton were gripped with the same terror that had plagued London. Doors were bolted shut at night. Men took to patrolling the roads, armed with anything they could find. The local authorities were overwhelmed with reports of a shadowy figure terrorizing the countryside. But just as quickly as the attacks had begun, they stopped. Spring-heeled Jack, it seemed, had moved on. These attacks almost seemed intended to stoke maximum fear. If he could carry out attacks in Northampton, he could strike anywhere, and no one was safe. By the time the panic had faded, Spring-heeled Jack had become something more than a mere attacker. He was now a living legend, a name spoken in hushed tones across England. Though his appearances had become sporadic, the fear never fully died. Every now and then a shadow glimpsed on a rooftop, or a figure moving unnaturally fast through the fog would reignite a small panic. Reports trickled in from different parts of the country, each one questioning whether Jack had returned or if he had ever truly left. In the 1870s, 3 decades after his first appearances, he struck again, and this time he set his sights on a new kind of victim, one not so easily frightened. Aldershot, home to one of Britain's most important military barracks, was not a place where ghost stories carried much weight. The soldiers stationed there were disciplined, hardened men, unshaken by superstition, yet they would soon find themselves face to face with something they could not explain. One evening, as a lone sentinel stood watch near the North Camp barracks, he became aware of a figure approaching from the gloom. The figure moved strangely, too fast, too light on its feet, as if barely touching the ground. The sentry called out, demanding the stranger identify himself. The figure gave no reply. Instead, it sprang forward, covering the distance between them in what seemed like an instant. Before the soldier could react, the apparition was upon him. He described it as a tall, gaunt figure wrapped in a tight-fitting dark suit, with glowing eyes that shone like embers. But what left the strongest impression on the soldier was the cold, metallic hand that clamped down on his flesh. He struggled to break free, but its grip was inhumanly strong. Then, with the same impossible swiftness, the attacker released him and leapt into the air, clearing a tall sentry box in a single bound. The soldier fired his rifle, the crack of gunfire shattering the silence of the barracks, but it was useless. The figure had already disappeared into the night. Soon, other sentries reported similar encounters, a shadowy figure that moved with impossible agility. On several occasions, he startled sentries at night by ringing the sentry post bell before bounding over nearby walls to evade capture. The military took the reports seriously. Searches were conducted. Guards were doubled, but they were never able to catch him. Though the military encounter at Aldershot was one of the last widely publicized incidents, it was far from the end of Spring-Heeled Jack's legend. For nearly 100 years, scattered and obscure reports of a mysterious leaping figure continued to surface, sometimes in the shadows of London's streets, other times in the countryside. Then, in 1938, something strange happened. A series of bizarre encounters took place across the Atlantic, in the quiet towns of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Thousands of miles from England, an ocean away from Jack's old hunting grounds, witnesses began describing something eerily familiar. The first report came from Provincetown, a small windswept village at the very tip of Cape Cod. A dark figure, described as inhumanly agile, was seen bounding across rooftops, effortlessly clearing fences and moving with unnatural speed. Witnesses were left shaken. No ordinary person could move like what they had seen. Days later, a startled motorist had a terrifying experience on a lonely road. Out of nowhere, a shadowy figure appeared in the middle of the street. The driver slammed on the brakes, but before he could get a better look, the figure sprang into the air in a single bound and vanished. The most chilling detail? The driver swore that just before it leapt, he saw two glowing eyes staring at him through the darkness. Then reports turned more sinister. Witnesses claimed the figure spat blue flames at them before leaping away. Those who saw it up close described a ghostly fire that didn't burn but left an unsettling sensation, as if the air itself had turned electric. This detail, eerily similar to the accounts from Jane Alsop and Lucy Scales nearly a century earlier, is fascinating. As word spread, locals began watching the rooftops, wondering if they would catch another glimpse of the leaping figure. The sheer height of the leaps, the impossible speed, and the ghostly way the figure seemed to vanish into the night left witnesses and those who knew them deeply unsettled. It seems unlikely that Cape Cod residents had ever heard of a century-old, relatively obscure Victorian-era legend from London, but somehow they seemed to encounter the very same thing, a shadowy entity with impossible agility and glowing eyes who was able to spit blue fire. Even in recent times, reports of strange figures and inexplicable sightings that echo the legend of Spring-Heeled Jack continue to surface. While the specific details may vary, many of these encounters share eerie similarities. In 1953, 3 Houston, Texas residents were sitting in the shade in front of their apartment building when suddenly a large man darted in front of them, crossing the lawn at a startling speed. With an unnatural bounding motion, he sprang up into a nearby pecan tree. The witnesses described the man as wearing, quote, tight-fitting clothes, a black cape, skin-tight pants, and quarter-length boots. As the trio watched in horror, the strange man literally disappeared in front of their eyes. In his book, The Mothman Prophecies, investigator John Keel spoke of interviewing a family from southeast Ohio who, in 1963 and 1964, had been plagued by what they called cattle rustlers. The figures would strike at night, and when pursued were able to, quote, leap over high fences from a standing start. In 1986, a strange figure was spotted near the border of England and Wales, leaping over high hedgerows. The witness described him as wearing a black ski suit and sporting an oddly pointed chin. It suddenly bounded straight at the witness, slapped him, laughed maniacally, and launched off into the nearby fields and out of sight. In Cornwall in 1996, a woman reported seeing what she at first thought was a sack floating at, quote, twice rooftop height. Upon looking closer, she realized it was actually a man dressed in dark Victorian clothing which flapped in the wind. She watched it for nearly 2 minutes. Apparently, the figure was trying to evade a dog chasing after it. After reviewing the many terrifying encounters and the lasting impact of Spring-Heeled Jack, it seems appropriate to address the question everyone familiar with the legend ponders: who or what was he? Let's break down the most popular theories to see which, if any, hold weight. One of the more intriguing and widely discussed theories posits that Spring-Heeled Jack was none other than Henry de la Poer Beresford, the Marquis of Waterford, a prominent figure in British aristocracy known for his unruly behavior and fondness for mischief. According to this theory, the Marquis, often described as a notorious prankster and a man with a flair for the dramatic, was responsible for the attacks, using his wealth and position to evade suspicion. The Marquis of Waterford was infamous for his rebellious nature and history of pranking. He and his friends once went on a drunken rampage through Melton Mowbray, painting doors and signs red as they went, a stunt so infamous that it likely inspired the phrase, "painting the town red." He was also known for playing cruel jokes on servants, peasants, and even people of higher status. His reputation for mischief included throwing servants into water troughs, booby-trapping his own home, and even disguising himself as a ghost or devil to frighten people. He was also said to have ambushed coachmen on dark roads, tying them up or overturning their carriages. With such a history, it's easy to see how he might have taken pleasure in terrifying the public with a figure like Spring-Heeled Jack. As a member of the British elite, the Marquis had both the resources and the freedom to carry out such acts without fear of immediate repercussions. He had access to large estates and the luxury of private spaces to craft his pranks, and his social status would have allowed him to move through areas unnoticed or easily dismissed. Given his wealth, he may have even experimented with mechanical gadgets to enhance the illusion of supernatural abilities. The Waterford theory is further supported by the fact that the first recorded sightings of Spring-Heeled Jack occurred around the same time that the Marquis was known to be in London, a city he frequented. It's even been suggested that the timing of the attacks and his known behavior during this period align with reports of Spring-Heeled Jack sightings. The Marquis of Waterford theory is intriguing, but several key issues weaken its credibility. There is no direct evidence linking the Marquis to the attacks, and while he was infamous for his cruel pranks, he did not consistently match the descriptions of Spring-Heeled Jack. Witnesses frequently described the attacker as unnaturally tall and agile, capable of leaping great heights, traits beyond extraordinary physical ability and unlikely to be achieved with mechanical assistance. Additionally, the sheer scale and frequency of the attacks suggest a level of coordination and persistence that seems unlikely for a wealthy aristocrat in the public eye, especially one known more for reckless, drunken brawling than calculated terror. Some modern researchers even question the validity of what is often considered the earliest spring-heeled Jack event, the Polly Adams encounter. This incident, though widely cited, lacks contemporary documentation, leading some to speculate it may have been embellished or fabricated later to create a narrative that conveniently implicated the Marquis. Another theory suggests that spring-heeled Jack may not have been a person at all, but rather an archetype, a mythical figure born from public fear and fascination with the unknown. Proponents argue that Jack represents a blend of societal anxieties, manifesting in various forms across different times and locations. However, this theory faces challenges, as it fails to explain the consistency of witness reports, the peculiar nature of the attacks, and the specific timing of sightings. While myths often evolve over time, the reliability of first-hand accounts and the dramatic details of the incidents make it difficult to dismiss Jack as mere folklore. The archetype theory doesn't fully account for the seemingly tangible presence of an individual figure who terrified real people during specific documented events. The ghost theory proposes that spring-heeled Jack was not a physical entity at all, but rather a supernatural apparition or spirit haunting London and other areas. Proponents of this theory argue that the eerie, almost unearthly abilities attributed to Jack, such as his ability to leap great distances and spit blue flames, suggest a non-human origin. However, the ghost theory has several drawbacks. First, witness testimonies often describe Jack in ways that imply he was a physical being, not an intangible spirit. The tangible nature of his encounters, such as physical assaults on victims, suggests a more earthly presence. Additionally, the theory struggles to explain the geographical spread of the attacks, which don't align with traditional ghost sightings, which are typically tied to specific haunted locations. The theory that spring-heeled Jack was an alien suggests that the strange abilities attributed to him, such as his impossible leaps, glowing blue flames, and his seemingly otherworldly presence, could be the result of an extraterrestrial being. His strange, almost supernatural traits hint at advanced technology, at least for the time. The idea that an alien might visit Earth in the form of a disguised figure, causing terror in small communities, fits with reports of some UFO sightings and alien phenomena. The drawback to this theory is that witnesses consistently described him as a human figure, and his physicality often matches that of a normal person rather than an alien entity. Then again, there are countless reports of alien encounters involving very human-like beings. And let's not forget, spring-heeled Jack was often described as having a ghastly, odd-looking face. The frustrating yet fascinating thing about the spring-heeled Jack saga is that to come to a conclusion, one must perform acrobatics of their own. If he were an ordinary man, how did he jump so high and live so long? Would British sentries really shoot at an archetype? Why would a ghost need to leap over walls instead of walking through them? Would an alien come all the way to Earth just to spit blue fire at people? The difficulty of explaining spring-heeled Jack has led some researchers to simply throw up their hands in frustration. But dismissing the entire phenomenon outright feels like both an evasion and an oversimplification. Unanswered questions are a natural part of history. If we were to disregard every event with lingering mysteries, we'd be forced to discard much of the past itself. Blackbeard, one of the most famous pirates of all time, has a history shrouded by inconsistent and sometimes bizarre accounts. Though he terrorized the seas in the early 18th century, the available records about him are limited. His death, which was reported by some of his own crew members, is particularly shrouded in mystery, with various accounts offering different versions of how he met his end. If history accepts the likes of Blackbeard, Jack should be no different. Each theory presents intriguing possibilities, yet none provide a definitive answer. The true identity of spring-heeled Jack remains as elusive as the figure himself, an enduring mystery that continues to defy explanation. He stands as one of the most perplexing figures of the Victorian era and beyond. Whether he was merely a man or something far stranger, his legend persists, passed down through generations, ensuring that his name will never be forgotten.